Hello, fellow alumni of Hope College. Greetings from our beautiful campus. My name is Matt Scogin, and as I like to say, I have the best job in the world because I get to be president of the best institution in the world. It's the institution that changed my life when I was here as a student. We've officially kicked off our 161st academic year, and this is also the start of my 4th year as president. And since the last few years have been unique, to say the least, we thought we would use the occasion, the start of a new season for Hope, to share a message with all of you, our alumni. And what I'd like to do is describe 3 things in this message. First, how we are doing as a college. Second, what we are working on for the future. And third, the role that I believe we are called to play in today's world. If you don't have time to listen to the whole message, here's the bottom line. Hope College has been part of my life in one way or another for more than 25 years. And I've never been prouder of this institution than I am right now. God is moving here. He's calling us to be a beacon of hope for the world. And He is blessing us and equipping us to do just that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the first point, which is how we are doing. And I'm very pleased to report that by any objective measure, Hope College has never been in a better position. Our academics, for example, had an exceptionally strong year last year. We saw a record number of faculty publications and the highest ever amount received for research grants. Hope College is ranked in the top 50 nationally for undergraduate teaching, and we're in the top 25 for undergraduate research. We're ranked among or above some of the world's best-known institutions. We're also doing some exciting things around the future of learning and the future of work. For example, the old CLET space is currently under construction. We're building out a new Center for the Future of Work, which intends to directly connect students' classroom experience to the changing nature of the workplace. Of course, at Hope College, we don't believe that learning happens only in the classroom. And for that reason, we don't talk about extracurricular activities. We talk about co-curricular activities. Activities that support, along with academics, activities that support a holistic education of one's mind, body, and spirit. There's a lot of things I could highlight in this area, but for the sake of time, let me just mention 2: campus ministries and athletics. We're proud to have a thriving campus ministries program which invites, doesn't require, but invites students to get to know themselves better by getting to know their Creator better. 3 times a week, Dimnit Chapel is packed with students who are choosing to worship there. In addition, our athletic programs at Hope have arguably never been stronger. Last year, 12 of our 22 teams won league championships, and 2 teams, the men's hockey club team and the women's basketball team, won national championships. Speaking of teams, I'm really proud of the team that we have at Hope right now. Last year, we appointed Dr. Gerald Griffin, whose background is in neuroscience, to be our new provost. And we also named Becky Starkenberg, who has more than 25 years of experience in higher education, to be our new dean of the students. The last thing I want to mention in terms of how we are doing is the most notable: enrollment. We recently welcomed over 1,000 new students to Hope College, 950 freshmen, and over 50 students transferring from other institutions to Hope College. This was our largest group ever of new students. The previous record-sized freshman class was 904. That was set back in 2012. There's actually a good argument to be made that of all the metrics we could look at for assessing the state of our college, enrollment is the one that tells us the most. Because if you really want to boil it down, a good college is simply a college that people want to attend. Conversely, a college can't survive without students. It can't thrive with dwindling enrollment numbers. But that's exactly the position almost all of our peer institutions find themselves in. Among private liberal arts colleges in our region, and among Christian liberal arts colleges nationally, enrollment is down, almost without exception. And yet somehow, in the midst of this nearly universal downturn, Hope has enrolled the largest number of new students ever, by a significant margin. It's a phenomenon that puts me in a somewhat awkward position every time I'm with other college presidents who are commiserating about their enrollment struggles. I find myself hoping that no one will ask me about our numbers, or if they do, they won't press me to explain our success. Because that's the hardest part. The hardest part is responding to the question, when everyone else is down, why are Hope's numbers up? And the reason that question is hard is not because I don't know the answer. Rather, the reason that question is hard is because I do know the answer, but I'm afraid to say it. Now, before I tell you what the ultimate answer is, let me first acknowledge that there are a number of secondary factors that we ought to talk about. For example, the most immediate factor driving these enrollment numbers is our admissions team. We have an admissions team that just worked their tails off, and I'm so proud of the effort they put forth. I don't want anything I'm about to say to obscure the fact that none of this could have happened without them. The same sentiment applies in varying degrees to every one of my colleagues at Hope, who through years of hard work have shaped Hope into a school that students want to attend. And actually, the same can be said of all of you, our alumni. Whether you realize it or not, you are all ambassadors for Hope in the various industries where you work and the communities where you live. So in that sense, our enrollment numbers are a reflection of you as well. It means this is very much a collective victory. But the reason I'm calling all of these secondary factors is because I don't think they're enough in and of themselves to explain why Hope's enrollment is up at the same time everyone else is down. Because if we try to explain this phenomenon nearly purely in terms of these secondary factors, what we're essentially saying is, I guess it must be the case that we're just smarter and harder working than everyone else. But that can't be it. Don't get me wrong, I think Hope is the best college on the planet. And so in that sense, our enrollment numbers are well-deserved. But I'm not willing to say that our peer institutions are not well-deserving also. I'm not willing to say that our enrollment numbers can be explained by our own superior merit. And so if it's not a matter of superior merit, what is it a matter of? And this is where things get a little uncomfortable. Because to me, there's only one explanation that makes any sense. The only alternative to receiving something by merit is receiving something by grace. And that's what I think is happening at Hope. I think God is showing us his grace. I think he is showing us favor. I think God is choosing to bless us. Now, ironically, this explanation can be actually more offensive to people than if I had simply claimed that we are smarter and harder working than everyone else. Why? Because if I base my explanation on merit, then at least I'm assuming that this world is one where all the results follow logically from our choices and our actions. But that's not my worldview. My worldview, in other words, my view of the world, is that this is a world that was made by somebody, and that somebody can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, without answering to anybody, without needing to explain himself. Why? Because his ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and the clay doesn't get to question the work of the potter. But it's hard for us to remember that because we ate the fruit in the garden we were never supposed to eat. And ever since, we think we're qualified to pass judgment on matters that are way above our pay grade. And so we ask questions like, well, if God wants to bless someone, why doesn't he bless everyone? I don't know. Or questions like, if God wants to bless someone, why would God choose Hope instead of some other school? I don't know. Or if God's favor isn't earned, then does that just mean it's arbitrary? I don't know. What I do know is that these are all the wrong questions because these questions are about whether God is doing his job the right way. And we don't need to worry about that. We need to worry about ourselves. And if we stop trying to do God's job for him, it actually frees us up to refocus on our own jobs. And that leads us to ask a whole different set of questions. Questions like, if God has blessed us, what are we supposed to do in response? Or what's his purpose in blessing us? How can we cooperate with it? And how do we avoid getting in his way? Unlike the first set of questions, the second set of questions is one to which we can actually find answers. For example, this question of God's purpose in blessing us. Well, that's actually a pretty easy one because God always blesses people for the same reason. What he says to Abraham is, I have blessed you to be a blessing. And it's the same with everyone he's ever blessed since, including us. He has blessed us to be a blessing. He has shown us favor so that we can extend favor to others. He gives blessings so that blessings can be paid forward. Or what about this question, how do we avoid getting in his way? Well, that too is an easy one because we see a pattern in Scripture. We open ourselves up to receiving more by saying thank you for what we've already received and acknowledging where it came from. I admitted that I'm afraid to tell other people about the real reason for our success, which is that it's the unearned gift of God. I'm afraid because I know how confusing that will be for some people, and also because I know it will make me look foolish and naive. But the reason I push past that fear and tell the truth anyway is because if I don't, It means I'm taking credit for what God has done. And that's one clear way to make his favor stop just as quick as it started. Because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. There's a lot more we could say here, but I want to move on. The main point is that Hope College has been blessed by God's grace. And the only two appropriate responses are one, to be grateful, and two, to pay the blessings forward. And this is precisely what we are trying to do as we look to the future. It's well known that the funding model of higher education is broken. And last year, when our board approved a new vision called Hope Forward, they essentially said, we want hope to run toward that problem. Hope Forward reimagines how students will fund their education in a way that we believe will actually enhance the learning environment. We call it Hope Forward because it essentially envisions a pay-it-forward funding model. Importantly, this is not free tuition. Actually, contrary to the way politicians often frame these conversations, there's no such thing as free education. A college education is and always will be very expensive. The question we ought to ask is, who should pay for it and when? Having students fund their education through gifts during their earnings years does a number of dramatic things. First of all, it solves the problem of access in a very real way, and no student will be burdened by debt after they graduate. Second, it moves away from a relationship that too often feels transactional to a relationship with students that's based on generosity and gratitude. When we're fully living into Hope Forward, we'll essentially have a crowd-funded model. Our graduates will be crowdfunding our current students, and that's exactly the way the Bible talks about how a Christian community ought to function, a community that's taking care of itself. In addition, because students have made a personal commitment to give their own money, we expect this will actually enhance educational outcomes. Why? Because students will feel personally invested. With current tuition rates, students can't work enough summer jobs or side jobs to fund their education themselves, which means someone else is paying for it. With Hope Forward, every student is making a personal commitment to give, and we think in the end, as a result of that commitment, students will take their education even more seriously. Today, thanks to your support, Hope Forward is not just an idea, it's a reality. We are in our second year of piloting this, and currently we have 2 cohorts on campus, representing about 60 Hope Forward students. We're learning a lot so far, and so far, all of our expectations are breaking to the high side. What we love most about this model is how connected it is to our mission. At the end of the day, the very simple version of the gospel message is you are covered. Now go and live differently. And that is precisely what we want to say to our students. You're covered. You're not burdened by debt. Now go and live a different kind of life, a life that brings hope to hopelessness. We all know there's a lot of hopelessness in the world today. And so far you've heard me say that hope is in a strong position, and we're using our position of strength to innovate in a way that's connected to our mission. The last thing I want to talk about has to do with the role I believe God is calling us to play in today's charged and divided culture. See, I believe God is calling us to be a source of hope, and I believe all people need hope. But I also believe that for us to fully pursue the purpose God has assigned to us, for us to walk unencumbered into increasing grace and favor and blessing, there are some things we need to leave behind. There's a certain dynamic that's been around as long as I've known Hope. It was already well established during my time here as a student in the 90s, but as I've become more acquainted with Hope's history, it's clear that this dynamic has been around much longer than that. The dynamic I'm referring to is that for decades, Hope has been subject to judgments from within our own community related to where we fall on 2 spectrums. The first is the liberal-conservative spectrum, and the second is the religious-secular spectrum. At times, it feels like debating these questions is our great collective obsession, as if this is all we care about. But of course, there's never been anything remotely resembling consensus on these matters. At any given point in our history, some will say that Hope is too liberal, while others will say that Hope is too conservative. At any given point in our history, some will say Hope is too secular, while others will say Hope is too religious. And as far as I can tell, after decades of debate, not one person has ever changed their mind. No one has ever switched sides, and no one has ever been convinced. And so the net result is that after all the back and forth, we find ourselves exactly where we started, which is squarely in the middle. The 2 sides cancel each other out. Neither side gets their way, and instead we continue walking along what's been called Hope's middle way. This goes all the way back to our school's founding. When the college was started, there was tension. One group, particularly the school's donors from the East Coast, wanted Hope to be a liberal arts institution that mirrored the colleges that already existed in the U.S. Northeast. Another group saw Hope as an institution that ought to be solely focused on training missionaries and ministers. Philip Phelps was hired as our first president, and he inherited this tension. And he said something bold. He said, we don't have to choose, we can do both. And this dual purpose, pursuing academic excellence within a decidedly Christian context, is distinctive. However, it's a shared mission that has also, over the years, been a source of tension and debate, and at times it's been crippling. Gordon Van Wylen became president during one of these seasons. When he started at Hope in 1972, he wanted to create a shared understanding of Hope's purpose and mission. This was the focus of his inaugural address. However, there was so much tension at the beginning of his presidency that he decided he had to wait. He's quoted saying, "Soon after I arrived at Hope, I realized that it would not be possible to achieve agreement on a basic, comprehensive, theologically rooted vision or mission statement at Hope College." Realizing this, he let the matter drop for 5 years. He came back to it in the late 1970s, then drafting language that realistically represented more pragmatic compromise than shared commitment. Nevertheless, that language has endured, and today, more than 40 years later, we're still living largely under the same missional language that was drafted then, language drafted out of compromise. And in light of this, I suppose you could say that everything's worked out just fine, that all's well that ends well. If the fighting over time results in perfect balance, perhaps we should just go on fighting. But there's another approach, which would land us in the same place and save a lot of energy. See, one way to stay in the middle is to maintain a constant fight between various sides. And that fight results in equilibrium in the middle. But another way to stay in the middle is to simply decide that we want to stay in the middle. And my question is, if history has proven that we're always going to end up back in the middle, then why don't we just agree to hang out in the middle together? Because in the end, it's actually not about saving energy. What I've come to see is that the middle way doesn't need to be about compromise at all. It's actually something that can and should be sought for its own sake, because it's intrinsically better than any other option. More importantly, as I see it, it's actually not an option. Pursuing the middle way is a necessity. It's something we must pursue. Because it turns out this middle way is at the very core of our identity. It's the foundation of who we are and what we've been called to be. And if we want to continue to enjoy God's favor and blessing, as I see it, there's no other way we can take. And I know that's a strong statement. And so with the time I have left, I want to make two arguments in support of it. The first argument is about the nature and essence of higher education itself. And the second argument is about the nature and essence of following Jesus. First, higher education. Second, following Jesus. And I'll start with higher education. The summary of this argument goes something like this. If a college or university wants to fulfill its true purpose, if it wants to continue to be an institution of higher learning in the truest sense, then it must fanatically avoid ideological or political allegiances. To unpack that, I think it might be best to start with a commencement address that Michael Bloomberg gave at Harvard a few years ago. In that speech, Bloomberg called everyone's attention to a very uncomfortable fact. Based on public information about campaign contributions, he noted that 96% of Ivy League faculty who donated money to political candidates did so in support of Democratic candidates. That is, 96% of faculty supported the same political perspective. Now remember, Bloomberg himself was a Democratic candidate for president. But instead of saying, "Hooray for our side," he had the courage to point out that this is a serious problem. And he put it like this. In the speech, he said, "Great universities must not become predictably partisan, and a liberal arts education must not be an education in the art of liberalism." In other words, you can't be a place that claims to endorse free inquiry when the answer to every question you ask falls predictably on one side of the political or ideological spectrum. It's a violation of the very idea of what it means to be a college to begin with. And yet, this is exactly what's happening. Ivy League institutions are quickly becoming places where free speech is rapidly disappearing altogether. Before, these schools wanted to teach students how to think. Now, it seems they're just teaching students what to think. And it's almost impossible to overstate how big of a problem that is, not just for higher education, but for our society as a whole. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Well, to me, it seems pretty obvious that there's only one solution worth pursuing. If the problem is ideological partisanship, the solution is to be decidedly nonpartisan. If the problem is uniformity of thinking, then the solution is to surround yourself with people that you disagree with. That's clearly the only antidote, and to me it just seems like common sense. But apparently it's not, because instead of that approach, the solution that seems to be gaining traction is to say, well, if the Ivy Leagues are biased in one direction, then we need to be just as biased in another direction, the opposite direction, to balance things out. This approach, to put it bluntly, is completely insane for a couple of reasons. First, it's just completely nonsensical on a theoretical level. You don't solve a problem by introducing new variations of the same problem. You can't decrease something by multiplying it. And yet, that's exactly what this approach does. It says, in essence, if that school is becoming fanatically liberal, then we need to become fanatically conservative. But second, we've already seen how this approach will play out, because it's already been tried in another area of public life on a very large scale. We have a 20-year case study we can look at, and the results have been nothing short of horrifying. What I'm referring to here is broadcast news. Because starting around 25 years ago, there was a growing awareness that journalism had the same problem that we're seeing today in higher education. Our most respected journalistic institutions, which we depended on for unbiased reporting, were sinking into partisanship. And so, like with higher education, the question was what should be done about it. But everybody who was concerned about this seemed to agree. And what they said was, let's try to beat them at their own game. We'll build our own news outlets, our own stations, our own websites, and we'll make them just as biased, but in the opposite direction. If they're shading truth one way, we'll shade truth the other way. Let's eradicate indoctrination by becoming even more committed to indoctrination. This is how we can save our country. Okay, so how did this approach play out? Well, the good news is we don't have to wonder. We know. We have 2 decades of history to look at. Did it work? The answer is yes and no. It didn't work as far as the most important things are concerned. Instead of saving our country, it has brought society to our most divided and fragile point in at least 150 years. Instead of saving the free press, it has rapidly accelerated the decline of the traditional press, which is now nearing extinction. The proliferation of fake news, which is just something we've become accustomed to today, was unthinkable 25 years ago. But this is a direct result of the strategy to fight bias with bias. And now we seem to be at a point where anybody can suppress truth for any reason at all. And of course, usually, that reason ends up being about money, which takes us to the sense in which this journalistic strategy did indeed work. In fact, it worked beyond anyone's wildest imagination. In terms of the financial growth of the institutions themselves, it was a jaw-dropping success. From a business perspective, Fox News is Rupert Murdoch's most lucrative project ever. And so that's the track record of the fight bias with bias approach, at least as it applies to journalism. We know how it worked. And therefore, we know what will happen if we adopt the same approach when it comes to our colleges and universities. On a societal level, adopting this approach will ultimately mean losing everything we've ever cared about. But on an institutional level, the short-term results for those colleges that take a page from the Fox News playbook will be just as dramatic. These schools will suddenly become very rich. Over the summer, a reporter named David Jesse, who writes for the Detroit Free Press, wrote a long-form article about this very issue. The headline read this way. It said, "Battle over wokeness at Christian colleges isn't just about politics, it's about dollars." He paints a picture of the higher education landscape where, with most institutions tilting left of center politically, there's an opportunity to be distinct by moving an institution decidedly right of center. From a fundraising perspective, it's proving to be increasingly lucrative. For the same reason it was so lucrative in the news industry, because there's an untapped market. The point is, whether you're a newspaper or a church or a college or a nonprofit or a business, the same rules apply. In our divided culture, you can raise a lot of money on the far left or the far right. You can gain a lot of attention there on the extremes. You can sell a lot of books there. You can gain a lot of social media followers there. But you can't have true inquiry. You can't have true discovery. And as long as I have anything to say about it, you won't find Hope College there. Why? Because what good is it if we thrive financially but forfeit our purpose in the process? What good is it if we gain the whole world but lose our soul? And make no mistake, that's exactly what's at stake here. Not just the soul of Hope College, but the soul of higher education itself. Ultimately, what's under attack here is the very purpose of the academy itself. What's the purpose of the academy? Well, there's a lot of ways we could answer that, but those answers must include things like freedom of inquiry and freedom of expression. Students ought to be exposed to competing ideas and different points of view, and yet today, students at too many places are being shielded from ideas they don't like or don't understand. In other words, the point of higher education is to be higher. The point of higher education is to transcend certain dynamics of our world and our culture. Guiding and protecting that elevated space is our sacred duty. It's our job, it's the post we've been assigned to, and we're not going to abandon it. Because this doesn't just threaten our educational system, it actually strikes at the heart of what it means to be a free democratic society. Anne Applebaum is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who's currently at Johns Hopkins. And she says that democracies over time will be tempted to become authoritarian societies. Because eventually, people fall more in love with their own ideas than they are in love with the idea of a free democratic society. If you don't like what someone said, if you find it offensive, you'd rather cancel them or suppress the message than support free speech. If you don't like the results of an election, you'd rather storm the Capitol than support a peaceful, democratic transfer of power. But see, before that can happen to a democracy, it first has to happen within the institutions that have been entrusted with safeguarding democratic principles. And that's already occurred within the press. It's up to us to prevent the same thing from happening within the academy. We, Hope College, an institution that has been providentially called to pursue the middle way for more than 160 years, can be that beacon of hope. In a world of extremes, we must fight to protect the middle, because that's how we can fight to protect higher education. That's my first argument. Now let me turn to my second argument, which is simply this. Walking the middle way is how we can truly follow Jesus. There's a passage in one of Paul's letters that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I'd like to read it to you. This is from 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter. And Paul says this. He says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many people as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I myself am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings." He's saying some remarkable things in that passage. First of all, he begins with this very strong language. He says, "I've made myself a slave to everyone." What he means is that he's putting himself underneath everyone. He's making himself a servant of all people. And then he tells us why he's doing that. He's doing it in order to win as many as possible. In other words, he's putting himself underneath others in order to influence them. He's serving others as a way of leading them. And then he goes on and he talks about all these different categories. He says he becomes like a Jew to the Jews. He becomes like those under the law to those under the law. He becomes like those not under the law to those not under the law. He becomes weak to the weak. And you and I might read that, especially in today's context. And we might say, pick a side, Paul. You're a chameleon. Pick a position. No one knows where you stand. You're not hot or cold. You're lukewarm. And by the way, these are exactly things that people have said to me. Are you afraid of losing followers, Paul? Are you afraid? Pick a side. No, we're not afraid of losing followers. If we wanted followers, we would pick a side. It's lonely in the middle. You get shot at from both sides. Are you trying to please everyone? Is that why you're not picking a side? Are you trying to please everyone? No, we're not trying to please everyone. We're trying to serve everyone. So Paul goes through this list of categories, and then at the end he says, in his climactic statement, he says this. He says, "I want to be all things to all people." And that is exactly where Hope College needs to be. All things to all people. Why? Because all people need hope. See, if there's anything we can all agree on right now, it's that everything is broken. Nothing in our world seems to be working. Hope is needed in every corner of creation and in every corner of every human heart. And it's our job to bring that hope in Jesus' name to those places. Not some of those places, all of those places. But we can't do it. We can't do it if we've allowed ourselves to be boxed in. We can't risk alienating half the people in this country by positioning ourselves one way or the other. We can't allow ourselves to be defined by the categories of this world. We can't allow ourselves to be labeled as one thing and not the other. We have to be all things to all people in order that we might win some. Now, what I'll say is that being in the middle doesn't mean that all of us as individuals have to be in the middle. For example, it doesn't mean that everyone who's part of our college community should be a political moderate. It also doesn't mean that because Hope College is a Big Tent, ecumenical Christian community, that all of us who are part of this campus should be non-denominational. To the contrary, we should be a place where each of us hold convictions, political convictions, theological convictions, but institutionally we're in the middle. Institutionally, we don't tilt to a particular side. And at the end of the day, what holds us together as a community are a common set of convictions about who God is and what He's done for us. These convictions, as expressed in the historical creeds like the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, have held Christians together for centuries. Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox Christians have held these in common for centuries. Now, to make this work as a community, there's a couple of pitfalls we have to avoid. One is simply name-calling, especially questioning each other's faith. We can't say, for example, you're not a Christian because you believe that. That kind of sentiment is completely out of bounds. Well-meaning followers of Jesus can disagree on a lot of things. And the second thing we have to avoid is trying to align the institution to a particular group or individual's viewpoint or perspective, because as soon as that happens, we've lost our middle way. I know I've been speaking in generalities up until now, but let me get a bit more specific. Because the area where we at Hope seem particularly vulnerable to these two pitfalls, at least in recent decades, is around human sexuality. And here's the bottom line. At Hope, whether you hold traditional convictions or progressive convictions on questions related to sexual orientation and gender identity, you are welcome here and you belong here. These topics are complex, and we have to avoid simplistic approaches. Within our college community, there are many tightly held convictions and beliefs, and this is a beautiful thing. We aspire to be a community that bears with one another in a spirit of mutual love and support. Now, I will admit that this kind of community is not for everyone. Some people may rather be in a community where everyone agrees on questions that can be divisive. And that's okay if that's what someone wants. Life is short. Go find a place like that. Just don't try to make Hope College one of those places, because it's not the kind of place God has called us to be. For those who do want to be part of this community, it's an incredibly rich and vibrant intellectual and theological environment, because the kind of conversations we want to have here aren't as simple as for and against, or right and left. Now, I know as I've been talking about these categories, a lot of you just can't relate. Maybe because you're not from this country and you don't understand our political categories, or maybe because these categories just don't represent you. And honestly, that's the point. See, the world wants to oversimplify and categorize every person and every organization. And we reject that premise, and instead put ourselves into the one category that transcends all the other categories. It's the gospel category. See, when it comes to this question of whether Hope should be more religious or more secular, my answer is no. I reject both choices. On the one hand, of course, I don't want Hope to become more secular, because the entire premise of secularism is laughably absurd. Without God, nothing makes sense. A world without God is a world without meaning. On the other hand, I don't want Hope to become more religious. Rather, what I have in mind for Hope is a community that truly follows Jesus. Jesus' critics were always trying to pin him down, trying to get him to pick a side. There's a moment, for example, when his critics come and ask him, what's the greatest commandment? And you can imagine in today's context, the conservatives would have wanted Jesus to pick one of the family values commandments, like don't commit adultery or honor your father and mother. And the liberals would have wanted Jesus to pick one of the more social justice-oriented commandments, like don't steal or don't bear false witness. But he doesn't pick a side. Instead, he says the greatest commandments are these: love God and love others. And all the commandments hang on those two things: love God and love others. That's the ethic of Jesus. A radical devotion to God and a radical love for each other. And that's what I want to characterize the Hope College community. a community that follows the one who rejected all the political and all the theological movements of his day and instead spent all of his time with people who weren't part of any movement because no movement would take them. I said earlier that this institution changed my life. To be more precise, it was encountering Jesus and his living hope while I was here as a student that changed my life. He's the one who has comforted me and challenged me and strengthened me through every season of my life. He's the one who speaks to me every day, not because I'm important, but just because I'm part of his flock and his sheep know his voice. See, we can define and shape what it means to be religious until it fits something that's convenient for us, but we don't get to decide what it means to follow Jesus. That's prescribed for us. Love your enemies. Give your money away. If someone asks you for a little, give them a lot. Love God and love others with everything you have. Believing the right things is easy. Following Jesus is hard. And at Hope, we strive for the hard thing. It means that we as a community have to stay in the middle because it's the only place from which we can truly call ourselves an institution of higher learning. And as followers of Jesus, staying in the middle is the only place from which we can truly fulfill our calling. What's our calling? To be all things to all people. Why? Because all people need hope. Spare and Deo. Thank you.